Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us here on this webinar today. My name is Michael Daniel, and I am the President and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance, a nonprofit threat intelligence sharing organization. And today I'm joined by some really cool people to talk about, well, okay, maybe not cool, but really interesting people to talk about cyber metrics. Like, how do we actually measure cybersecurity? A problem that has bedeviled our industry for decades. So let me turn to each of the participants in this webinar to introduce themselves. So Wade, I'll start with you since you're in the upper left corner of my screen.
Not because I'm the coolest.
No, afraid
Not
not.
okay.
Although you
I'll accept
definitely
that.
have
I'll
the,
accept that.
yeah, but you have the coolest background. I mean, that just, anybody with large swords like wins the,
Uh,
coolness factor in
I
my
I got to do
book.
something, right? Because
Right.
nothing else helps me win that. Hey everybody, Wade Baker. I am one of the co-founders of the Cyentia Institute, a data-driven research firm. I am also a professor in the Pamplin College of Business at Virginia Tech.
Great. Thank you, Wade. Alex?
Hey folks, I'm Alex Pinto, and I am the lead of the team that puts together the data breach investigation report in Verizon every single year.
Great. Chris?
Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Wysopal. I'm co-founder and chief security evangelist at Veracode. We are a software security testing company that publishes the State of Software Security Report.
Great. And going to our best dressed, Jay Healey. So,
Hey everyone, I'm Jay Healey. I'm a senior research scholar at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs and been doing work for about 15 years looking at systemic cyber risk and whether or not we are winning or not.
great. So thanks, gentlemen, for joining me for this discussion today. I'm going to start with a question that seems obvious in some levels. We talk about how hard it is to measure cybersecurity. But why is measuring cybersecurity so hard? What makes this such a difficult problem that our industry has struggled with it for at least 20 years, probably 30 or 40? Anybody want to jump in on that one?
I could start. One of the things that's I've always found problematic is we count vulnerabilities, and oftentimes we count breaches, but it's really hard to totally connect the two. It's just kind of anecdotal. I love the Kev list, the known exploited vulnerability list. But just because of the secretive nature, no one wants to really talk about their incidents. We just seem to be lacking a connect the dots. We have lots of things to count, but it's really hard to connect the dots between, a flaw in software and what the real impact in the world is, for instance.
Yeah, clearly, and we talk about certain things, and even, I mean, we'll get into this, right? But even if you look at the Kev list, if there's more on the Kev, if there are more vulnerabilities on the Kev, is that good or is that bad? Right?
Right. Each one could be exploited once, right? Or there could be something on the list that's been exploited a million times. How
Right.
are we weighting something on the Kev list, for instance? We're sort of missing that part.
Yeah.
I'll jump in. I've tried to measure all kinds of things in security, and I've never run out. I've been doing it for many years now. There's always something more I want to measure. So I think that's part of the challenge is you could literally measure anything. And the question becomes, what's worth measuring? When I measure it, what is it going to tell me? What do I do with it? So I think every one of us would probably answer that question a little bit differently. So just the sheer volume of things to measure and what those mean, I think, is a major challenge for any kind of agreement on what should we measure at a broad scale.
Yeah, there was I spent the early part of my career at the Office of Management and Budget in the National Security Division there. And there was a famous interaction once where a director asked one of the senior examiners, about some numbers in a budget presentation. And in a fit of honesty, he said, "Oh, we made those numbers up several years ago, and we've been tracking them ever since." So, there's definitely some truth to like you pick some stuff and you start measuring it, and eventually, like the measure itself sort of becomes the end as opposed to a tool to achieve another end. and you end up with like tracking numbers that just don't actually add anything to the conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If I might go, I think to make Wade's point even more salient, right? It's not that there is a lot of different things to measure, but in a way they all matter according to what discipline of cybersecurity you are more interested in, or do you perceive as the one that's most risky to you. And so should we be counting, like, to beat a dead horse, how many people are clicking on phishing emails, right, at any point in time, right? And this is a metric that has been, maligned and reveled for a long time, but it's something that might be helpful for you to understand how you want to structure your training regimen, or how you want to handle phishing on your environment, if you believe that phishing is a credible threat to whatever you're trying to put together. And so, but it becomes a lot of scattered minutia, some things that are very spread out, and I think we don't struggle to have data. I think we don't struggle to have things to measure, but we struggle to put together what does a big picture look like. And so, how can I put all those things that really don't add up to each other, and how do I create the unified equation of security? Right, is really what has eluded everybody for a very, very long time, right?
And for
Yeah.
me, oh, sorry, Michael. And for me, when I think about it from the policy level, and I've seen these, I've done some of this work at CISA and at White House, and we're so rich in metrics, but so many of them are meant for the enterprise level, right? A lot of the frameworks we have, like FAIR or CyberVAR, the rest, they're meant for people with purchase authority, right? They're meant for companies and the rest. And so when we say, well, how's the United States doing? Um, uh, it, we don't have much. And a lot of those metrics are good for how each of us are doing, right? If you want to say, how is my organization doing on cybersecurity? You've got frameworks, you've got metrics, and you can kind of choose. And we don't have that at the larger level. And in part, I kind of blame our strategies and our policymakers to some degree, because if you were in the military and you've got a boss and fighting a counterterrorism fight, and your boss says our job is to win hearts and minds, and your next boss says we need to engage in far fights with the adversary, in each case the kinds of stuff you're going to measure. And I think we haven't done a good job at the system level to say, well, what's success? Like, how are we going to define this? Because once you start saying what's important, what's winning look like at the policy level, then you can say, oh, these metrics matter more than these metrics at that higher level. And so, and our work has been saying, okay, well, based on different definitions of winning, what's the framework so you can say, all right, if the number of kevs go up or down, is that likely to indicate success or not?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, Jay, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, a couple of things that I want to, sort of dig into what you were just saying, right? One is that measuring cybersecurity at the organizational level is different than measuring it at a national level or an ecosystem level. And to some degree, I would argue that some of the issue has been that we've perceived cybersecurity as purely a personal or organizational issue, weirdly. Like, in other words, that the responsibility for that is sort of all on the organization. So therefore, we must just be able to take each organization and sort of sum it up, and you'll get to, how cybersecurity, in an ecosystem, sort of forgetting that the entire thing about the internet is that it's all interconnected, right? But let's actually try to pull this out. And Chris, maybe I'll start with you of like, how do you think about like cybersecurity differently? How do you think about measuring cybersecurity differently at a organizational level versus an ecosystem level or a national level?
Yeah, so I think like Jay was saying, a lot of these frameworks are set up for an individual CISO to, attempt to find the risk level the organization it can tolerate, and sort of stay there with changing threats that happen over time, and that all makes sense. but it does ignore the fact that that we do have an ecosystem problem, right? Like I always think of, the individual doctor's practice and the CDC, right? Like an individual doctor might be, oh, I see an uptick in flu, right? But that's not that interesting, right? It may be interesting for that one doctor. That's sort of the enterprise, right? But if if since we have the CDC and they report these numbers and to an authority that can collate these things together, we get a national picture of how the flu outbreak is doing, how the flu how the vaccine for the flu is doing this year. Is it doing poorly? Do they screw it up? Like you can make decisions because you aggregate this data. And one of the nice things is, obviously we have doctor-patient privacy, but the data then gets anonymized to come up to the other level. So, I think we want to do something sort of in that direction because no enterprise or even small business or organization wants to be embarrassed, right? So they're not going to share their data. But we need this kind of public data sharing, and we also need to show reasons why this is important. Like you say, there's a lot of ecosystem problems out there. I think of, the Soho routers being used to attack critical infrastructure, is a good example of each individual doesn't care that much about their router, right? It's working for me.
Yep.
As long as the router works and I don't need to replace it, even though it's end of life. And I think these ecosystem things are just going to grow over time, and we need a way to tackle it and not think of it as each in individual problems.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, looking at it from, you know, those systemic levels is really looking at like how is it affecting populations as a whole, right? And I think your connection to public health is actually a really interesting one, right? I mean, I'm a big fan of the work that Cyber Green is doing to, try to look at this from a public health lens, right? Because that's not a lens that we often look at cybersecurity from. Um, but I think there's a lot of interesting parallels there about how we've built some of the structures to do public health, for example. I think, Wade, from your perspective at Cyentia, given the amount of data that you work with and things, how do you think about sort of the difference between kind of ecosystem level, national level metrics versus an organizational level set of
Yeah.
metrics?
That's a good question, and I'll be frank and just say that much of what we do and much of our thinking, my thinking, is around the organizational level. Generally,
Yeah.
I'm trying to measure this for organizations, but I'll share my screen and give a few examples of how these different contexts matter a lot. So what I'm going to share now comes from a report that anyone can freely access, the Information Risk Insight Study 2025, scientia.com/iris. It's free, sponsored by CISA. This is measuring the probability of any given organization suffering an incident, a reportable incident. These would be publicly known or disclosed incidents. 15 years ago, about 2.5% in a year. Fast forward to most recently 9.3. So a large increase in probability at the organizational level. This is any given organization. But let me just switch context here. And now let's look at groups of organizations. Again, this is not national or ecosystem, but if you look at this question among the large enterprise, so if we look at all really large organizations, there's actually a different story. Instead of increasing almost fourfold over that period of time, it's now decreasing pretty well. It's the small and medium segment of the economy that is increasing. And so you could slice this up a number of ways. You could look at this. We haven't done it at the national level and compare countries or regions. And I think you'd see different directions in these things that we can measure, right? And I think that's important, right? You might have a very different policy if you base it on a fourfold increase in the probability of an incident for an organization, then and that policy may be not very great for the largest enterprises, right? So I think these things are really important to keep in context, and that's why measuring and being specific about what you're measuring and why is so critical, especially when you go to inform policy people, which I've never been on the policy side, but I like to produce measurements that inform those kinds of things. And, it's easy to get wrong and mislead.
Yes,
I
that
think,
falls into the old Mark Twain adage about, lies, damn lies, and statistics, right?
Yeah.
So it is easy to sort of go in that direction. But Alex, you wanted to follow in on that?
yeah, I think this is a valid approach when you think about an ecosystem level solution to that, right? You could measure on the organizational level and then aggregate it, right? I do believe that this might be the best that can be done without a specific wheel or strategy from a national level on what matters to be measured the most, right? So again, not a policy person at all, but we probably should be counting critical infrastructure more. They should have a weight there up, right? Because we really don't want these things to break. And so, but again, I think it comes to a point that Chris was saying, right? The challenge is that from an organizational level, we tend to think about security on an organizational level, something that you said, because there is an understanding of agency, as in, look, I'm not saying everybody does a good job at that, but at least on an organizational level, these are knowable problems, right? You could potentially find everything that's afflicting you. You could potentially find every vulnerability, right? You have the agency and the scope there to do that work. To try to look at that at a larger lens, you would need these people to volunteer that information because they're not required to, and they won't because of liability, because of embarrassment, and all of that. So my personal hobby horse lately has been that we have been doing such a good job on, we historically, it's been 10 years now since the Cybersecurity Act, which created the information sharing for IOCs, I think. And so from there, from sharing IOCs freely, we've been sharing TTPs so freely. I mean, compared today, everybody publicly talking about what nation state A or B are doing, as opposed to when the APT1 report dropped, everybody went insane. Oh, how are they saying this? Can they say this? Right? But the next step is instant data, right? And I mean, we know it's possible from my perspective, from Wade's perspective as well, right? There can be, if instant data is shared, if there's incentive for instant data to be shared, it can be aggregated and it can be analyzed to create a view. Maybe not so much if we're winning or not, but at least, okay, this is the biggest problems right now. So any program, any sort of direction that we put, I mean, regulation, I'm going to say the bad word here, or anything else where more sharing happens and more data can be glimpsed, it's going to be a net positive for everybody, right? That's how we get to national numbers. That's how we get to ecosystem numbers, by incentivizing people to safely, in a liability sense, to report.
And Michael, if I can first build on Alex's point and then continue to what I thought about when you asked your question. And one of the things that I've found as I've been looking across this has been so much of the information is already pooling in select locations, right? A lot of that information is pooling within Veracode. It's pooling within Verizon, thanks to what they've done with Veris. It's pooling in databases like Advisen. And so our work has been, like, I think there's a good intermediate, right? I like how Alex laid out where we can get with this when we're doing information sharing correctly, if we have a Bureau of Cyber Statistics and the rest. Is an intermediate point, we said, well, let's just go where the information is already pooling, right? Instead of trying to collect the data ourselves. I was very, a little dismayed when I was trying to do some of this work within CISA. CISA had a systemic cyber risk reduction initiative that was out at NRMC when we were working with Bob Kolaski, with Bob Lord and the Secure by Design. And I was basically told if the data isn't CISA owned, if we don't have the data internally, we're not interested. Which struck me as as too bad because we've got great options out there where the information is already being pulled. It's being reported in these annual threat reports. It's being reported in IRIS and the state of software security reports. And to me, one reason why this is also difficult is in the enterprise level, we kind of we're looking for different cause and effect, right? Generally, the cause and effect there is tied to return on investment for security products, right? How can I most reduce my risk by applying these controls that's going to affect the adversaries or it's going to affect CIA in the confidential integrity and availability in these various ways. That's a tough cause and effect, but like Alex said, it's kind of knowable. And when you then say, all right, well, what is happening with the public policy cause and effect? Right? Department of Defense wants a couple extra billion. I'm sorry, the Department of War wants a couple extra billion to be able to do persistent engagement. Okay, that's great. What security results are we getting from that investment? We don't know, right? We've got we can start to make some of these assumptions that what we do with KEV or a MITRE ATT&CK framework or sharing IOCs maybe has more ROI than precision, but we don't really know. And that's why I love the work, for example, that Wade just showed, right? Of saying, boy, we knew we had a problem. It felt like it was getting worse. But just with the work that he's done for CISA with these IRIS reports, we now know it's not getting bad universally. It's getting bad just for some, whereas the richest companies are doing better. That allows us to ask better questions. That allows us to interrogate for these public policy purposes about why that might be, and therefore what else we can do.
Yeah, and I think a lot about like my experience of being in the White House and trying to, distill for senior policymakers, for the, National Security Advisor, Homeland Security Advisor, the President, Chief of Staff, others, so is it actually getting better or worse, right? And I think it's too easy for us in the cybersecurity space to, Herb Lynn had a good saying, one time where he said, yeah, it's very easy to be a cybersecurity expert. Just declare that today is worse than yesterday and tomorrow will be even worse still, and it's like, well, yes, but that's not very helpful, right? And it's not, it doesn't actually help you make better decisions. And that's really what we're trying to get at here is how can we make better decisions at a national level, at an ecosystem level about where to put those investments. Where do we actually need to have increased collaboration between the government and the private sector, for example? Where do we want to focus? So I want to actually drive us to think about like two more questions, which is how should we organize our thinking in this space, right? To Wade's point, like analysis point, we got a lot, and Jay, you're right, we got data all over the place. I mean, CTA is a repository of nearly, I think we're approaching 1 billion IOCs, right? I mean, but like, what does that has utility, right? But in what context, right? We've got a lot of data. We're swimming in data. And so how do we organize our thinking about this to find the metrics that we actually care about? And then let's actually talk about some of them that could be candidates for sort of a national level discussion. Because I'll also throw in one other thing, which is that when you go to talk to policymakers and other things, you've got very limited time and very limited space. You are not going to present a briefing deck with 80 slides and 75,000 metrics in it, right? Not going to work. You're going to get it down to a single slide with like 3, maybe 5 if you're really pushing things, right? You got to get it down to a very small number, a handful of metrics that are really indicative. It may rely on a lot of other metrics, right? But are indicative of the point you want to make and the decision you are asking for. And I think that's really some of the framework that I want to put on this. So, Jay, I know you've done a lot of thinking about this, sort of how should we organize our thinking in this space?
Yeah, I've been on a journey, I think like all of us have, to think about this. And when I started, I was really influenced, some by public health, but also by environmentalism and saying, all right, they have all these great ways. They've got a goal, right? One point, we want to keep below 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. You can measure consequences. You can measure output of CO2 and the rest. And Phil Venables was just like, don't mess with that stuff. Just do threat. All you're talking about is threat, vulnerability, and consequence. Just use threat, vulnerability, and consequence. We don't need to use these analogies. Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. And so I started just looking at threat, vulnerability, and consequence. And I kind of agree with you, Michael, but I'll push back a little because there might be some candidate metrics, and we might talk about some. I know you've got one or two that you like that represent really good proxies. That you say, I know when I worked for Phil Venables, right? He was getting these for the board, right, at the enterprise level. He had Microsoft running 6-month average of Microsoft patch status was a board level metric for Goldman Sachs, not because there was anything magical about it, but because if you were doing that right, there was probably a bunch of other things that were also going well. And so there might be a few of those, and I know you've got your favorite, Michael. I call them, they're kind of proxies, like proxissimo, like they're just the best proxy that are really good at representing a few. What some of our work has been is saying, okay, we have those, but what's our narrative? What's the set of logical progressions, right? Okay, if we see the number of 0 days go up, does that mean we're winning or losing? If we see the number of kids go up, does that mean? And you can't judge it just based on an indicator for those. You need some kind of logical set of progressions of saying, wait a minute, if we're disrupting adversaries, not just like really actively, but if we're just doing a better job at patching and writing better software, as if everyone's using bought Veracode and they're using Veracode, great. Then what would we expect to see? Right, we would expect to see a faster turnover of adversary TTPs because the stuff that you worked last year doesn't work this year. We would expect to see a faster turnover of vulnerabilities because of vulnerabilities that weren't last year. We'd expect to see a decreasing average age of vulnerabilities used in successful exploits. If all of that is true, we'd also expect to see more 0 days come out. We might expect to see more KEVs come out. And so what I really am hoping that we can do through these efforts of all of us getting together like this is what are those stories? What are those narratives? What are those logical progressions? Because we're decades into this and we haven't thought about that at the systemic level of, all right, if persistent engagement is working, what changes in adversary behavior would we expect to see at large? Because the answer just can't be it's classified. No, if it's classified, all you're doing is you're shooting and they're keeping their heads down. We ought to see some observable indicators across threat, vulnerability, and consequence if anything that we do is succeeding.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And I think certainly you can, organize it along those lines. You know, I don't know if any of the rest of you want to get in on sort of the idea of this, kind of threat, vulnerability, and consequence, but it's a very easy to understand model, right? And that's what you're going for again and trying to talk. And I agree, Jay, by the way, that in many cases you're talking about lifting up specific metrics that rest on a whole lot of other things that you may be tracking at lower levels, but you're trying to be indicative of what's happening.
Yeah, and that doesn't help me for a dashboard. Like the stuff I'm saying is all good to develop a report and to come up with logical propositions, but it's not a dashboard. So the dashboard, you either got to come up with these great single proxies, or you have to try and do an index or something else, and all that gets a little fraught if you want to try and simplify.
There's another aspect of it, because if you're going to use this for decision making, you want to have leading indicators versus trailing indicators, so you find out quicker in time. So like the example is I think the Veracode data of like how many critical vulnerabilities are in our customers' code that they're developing right now would be on the leading side because some of that stuff hasn't even shipped yet. Versus I was just trying to think of what would be the worst trailing indicator, like the amount of money in a ransomware gang's bank account, right? the consequence side. So, I think that's important to think about when we're going to design what are we going to measure. It's like, yes, we can measure, and it is an indicator of the health, but how useful is it? It's more useful if it's more leading than not.
Yeah, so
I'll tag on,
no,
sorry,
go ahead.
to Chris's comments there about the Veracode. This is the 2025
Yeah.
State of Software Security from Veracode, and just take this bottom one. I think it's a good measure to look at the trend for high severity vulnerabilities discovered in software. Before it's released, we want it to go down. There are things that would make it go up if more people start using Veracode, and other software is going to go up, but this is within a steady state of Veracode customers at least, and you're seeing that drop by more than half. I think that's a really good indicator of better software, which leads to a more secure ecosystem. So, measuring things like that at a larger level, I think very positive.
Yeah, and I think, there are some times when at a national policy level, you want to be measuring certain things that may be lagging, right? But it's because you actually really care about the impact that they're having. So, for example, if you're measuring sort of economic loss due to cybercrime, right? Then, that's actually probably something worth measuring at the national level because that actually has that should influence like, what kind of resources are we willing to put against this problem?
Yep.
You know, the and if the economic losses are really huge, then that might justify some fairly substantial investments in trying to reduce those losses. But then and I think, Jay, this is a discussion point that you and I have had several times, and I think Alex probably would reflect this. Yeah, is oftentimes what we care about is not the number, but the trend.
Mm-hmm.
Like we often care not so much about the specific number, but is the trend going in the right direction? Alex, but
Yeah, I
you
do.
wanted to get in.
Yeah, I do have something about that to the point of the trend, right? So we're talking about the training indicators, right? One of the things we got for this last CBR, the 2025, was, and this is representing the loss due to ransom payment. So these are losses directly to the threat actor. And we saw a huge spike from 2022 to 2023 data, right? So this is the median amount. We're talking about 75-ish thousand to 150,000. But then we saw a reduction on the medium amount. And even on the extreme amounts here, we also saw it being pulled a little bit more to the left side. And we're talking about a median of 115,000. And so one of the things that came out of it as we were interrogating our partners and our SMEs was that, less people are paying the ransom. And so there's more economic pressure of trying to get a deal as fast as you can and lowballing it so you can just get them to pay and just be done with it. Like for a threat actor, the more time they're negotiating, there's more exposure. It's like any other crime, right? And so this is something that was fascinating to see. And one interesting thing we didn't publish was that we saw like 64% were not paid. Of the ones that didn't have encryption was just kind of the extortion part. That number was even lower. And yeah, we didn't publish that because, of course, I mean, you're going to just release it anyway. I don't care, right? But I'm running, I'm fine. And we're like, we're not going to release that because maybe that will cue the actors to like encrypt more. And so we're like, yeah, we don't want to be responsible for that. So cue like Mark and Spencer co-op and a lot of like more destructive ransomware attacks we have been seeing lately. Again, we're seeing kind of economic forces at play here as they're trying to. But this is a thing, right? And this is one of the paradoxes. It's a thing that Jay said. Number of 0 days trending up is a good indicator. You know what I mean? We're doing a better job. Nobody's happy. This doesn't benefit anyone that there are more 0 days at play now. But it shows the progression of the industry, right? We've always, like, for the past 20 years, everybody was talking about, it's a cat and mouse game. right? We're always trying to outplay each other. But it's really becoming a sort of fever pitch as we see things like, okay, more destructive to force payment, more 0 days because the vulnerability management is getting better, and you can't just like skirt through with a 10-year-old vulnerability. So anyway, it's a lot of like systemic things you can look at the end of the day to try to like I said, the proxy stuff, like Jason said before.
And I hope that the panelists can see why we like getting together like this, right? Because we can have these conversations now where you say, I wonder about X, Y, or Z. And there are folks out there now that can say, wait, let me pull up that chart. Let me show you, and we can look at those trends, right? We don't have to be lost anymore on these. And we have a lot of data. It's not always reported in a trend line, right? So that's part of our work has been saying to those with data, make sure you're telling the trend line, because with the trend line, we can tell if it's getting better or worse. And Michael, what I'd really like to see is wouldn't it be great as we work, as this kind of work develops, working with ONCD, the Office of the National Cyber Director, or other countries, as they say, we want to do a new national strategy, and we're going to have these goals and these elements. And wouldn't it be nice to have that conversation, right? This could have happened with like the implementation team that says, how would we measure these?
Right.
And some community like this says, well, we've got these measurements that we can do now. Let us come back to you on these. And it's upfront about, good, what can we measure and what we can't? And can we reframe some of the pillars in a new national cybersecurity strategy or some of the actions so that we have some that are more measurable than others, right? We can do that. We are mature enough in public policy now in the United States to have an Office of National Cyber Director that can do this. We're mature enough with the work of those that are in this room, as well as a lot of others, right? There's a bunch of other folks that we could have had in this that are doing super cool work. And that would be a real sign of maturity, I think, if we can get there.
Yeah, and it's like I think there's also the being able to do those cross-country comparisons, right, would be really interesting, right? Because then you can start to imagine you could this takes you down the path of being able to do like global indexes, right, of cybersecurity, or having, different factors being included in there, and then you start doing the things that, data scientists like Alex and Wade do, which is like controlling for different geopolitical environments. And, then you start disaggregating and saying, okay, well, this sector is, these sectors are heavily regulated in almost every country. And how does that look compared to these sectors? And, then you can start asking really interesting questions too. But I think you're right, Jay. You've really also got to know what it is that, and when you say narrative, what I actually think of there is we're starting to apply science to this. In other words, you've got a hypothesis and you're going to test it against some data rather than sort of, it being kind of this back of the envelope sort of assumption, and then it's all, decision by anecdote. Yeah, go ahead,
I have
Alex.
an anecdote about that, to your
There you go.
point. One of the things that was when I joined the team, the DBR team, one of the things that always bugged me was that our numbers for healthcare around ransomware were always higher, significantly higher than the other industries. And this was a time before ransomware actors got into the practice of extracting the data and kind of naming their victims. So it was very much, there was no obligation there isn't an obligation to report still, but now it's very public, right? Most of them are public now. And so it always bugged me, why do they have so much, right? What's wrong? Are we doing something wrong? Are we collecting wrong data? And people were explaining to me, no. Here's the thing. According to HIPAA, and again, very US-centric here, they are required to report any ransomware incident as a breach as well, because there was the potential for the data to be exfiltrated. And I'm like, well, this probably means that this is the real number, that what's happening, and not everything else. Today, the level of ransomware in healthcare is the same as every other vertical, right? Because now it's all kind of public, right? And so you want to know the next one that's going to happen if there is more like mandatory reporting of incidents, errors. So when we go to like ICO, we go to like GDPR countries, the amount of error-based breaches that they have is incredibly higher than what we track here in the US because they're, again, there might, if they can keep it on the hush hush, they're just not going to say about it. So you can always get some interesting insights from there when you try to compare again different regulatory, different incentives environments. So it's always something that I find fascinating in the work that we do.
Yeah, Wade, do you have a favorite metric that you like that you've come across, sort of recently that you think could be scaled up to inform kind of national level policy?
I have a few, and again, there are a lot of metrics that I like in certain contexts. Just because we've talked about it a lot, I'll go back to, the state of software security. Even more than just measuring the number of vulnerabilities in software, I like measuring software debt or security debt, because it's a combination of uh, important or critical vulnerabilities and also that have been around unresolved for a long time. So I think that's a great measure of the state of the security of the software itself and how organizations are responding to that and doing something about it. So, I like metrics that combine that. But at a higher level, we've talked about consequence several times. I would love to see a lot more measurements around consequences, both at the organizational level and at the national level. Organizations you're starting to see more reports of the financial losses associated with incidents, but to Alex's point, that has a lot to do with regulation and requirement to report, and generally it what is reported are the things that can be easily counted and reported. At the national level, you just don't see it very often because I don't think there's a rolling up. I mean, you see reports like the CSI FBI study that are done every year about, they have a roll up of financial losses,
Right.
but that's mainly consumer level events that are reported to them and then they aggregate that. But, it's really hard to get a total view of all losses. But I think we need to start chipping away at it because that really gets to where are we being effective, and if we can trend that over time, I think we could do a lot with that, right? It not only informs strategy, how much do we want to spend, it informs tactics. We can do that, break that down at the industry sector, organizational level. And I like adversary stuff too. Sorry to talk for a long time, but on the other side of the coin, I think it was Jay that mentioned, can we measure adversaries changing their TTPs? That's been one that I've really been interested in because I do think that that's what we want to do, right? We want to force some changes. In fact, I've had people argue as like, well, why do we, even bother? Because adversaries are just going to change their tactics and we'll be right back at square one. And I think that's terrible thinking because no, we want to force them to change, and the
Right.
more often we do that, they don't get a solid foundation and just keep reaping, off the same old attacks all the time. So that's actually a good thing if adversaries change a lot. So anyway, there's some things I'm interested in.
Yeah, no, I think those are all, really interesting too. And it also strikes me that there are things that you can also ask, like, okay, if something proves to be sticky, why is it being sticky? So like the you take a look at the exploit prediction scoring system, for example, and you look at what are the top vulnerabilities that are most likely to be exploited in the next 30 days. And you got this 2012 vulnerability from Microsoft hanging out there at the top of the list consistently. Okay, why is that thing so sticky? Like, why is that so staying so exploitable after so much time, right? What about that makes that a hard problem to get out of the ecosystem, right? It tells you someplace to go look to actually understand what the underlying story is. But it's got to be more complex than like people just don't patch, right? Because like other things have gone by the wayside. So there's something about that leads you down a different, lead you down a different path.
I think we have another example of that. Wade was talking about the security debt, right? It's like it's taking
Right.
more than a year for this vulnerability to be removed from the software. And so I think that's an important way to say, like, what's the problem here? And one of the ways we sliced it in the State of Software Security report was by whether the debt was in first-party code or third-party code. And it was really interesting to see that for if we looked at just the critical security debt, so just the high and critical severity vulnerabilities, the majority of it was actually in third-party code. 70% of the critical security debt was in third-party code, where if we just looked at all security debt, it was only 11%. So there's something about like these critical bugs that are difficult to patch in the third-party code. And so this is something you can say, look, we need to improve that, right? Of course, we need to improve the whole open source ecosystem. So there's less likely that those vulnerabilities exist. But like, what is causing what in the way that dependencies are dependent on other dependencies and the way that people are using open source software makes those difficult to patch. And so we could eliminate a lot of vulnerabilities by try to understand some of this. And I see that as another stickiness issue.
Yeah.
And if I can jump in here, it's great. I really like this. And a lot is what we mean. So if we're looking, what are some really interesting metrics at the system level? Some of it gets to how we think about winning, right? To me,
Right.
winning is shifting the advantages from the defender, from the attackers to the defenders. And so I love the metric that started in the Verizon Data for Investigation report was the average mean time to detect. Which used to be hundreds of days, like 225 days or so, and it's come down to about a dozen days, even when you control for ransomware. Even if you say, well, ransomware wants to get detected, even if you control for that, it's substantially come down. Because that's one of these few metrics where you can actually see really nakedly, very raw, this balance between our adversaries better at hiding or our defenders better at detecting. It's a great, great statistics. And what I love about it, it's reported not just by Verizon, but it's reported by Mandiant and others using different data sets. And so when we see the same trend reported from different folks that have different data sets, that can give us a lot more faith in the fidelity. Another one, and this would be, I think, really difficult to try and measure, but I look to especially Wade and Alex on this, is wouldn't it be nice if we had more Sonys and fewer NotPetya's? In which I mean, in NotPetya, you had one adversary that was able to affect thousands of companies. Same thing with SolarWinds. In Sony, yeah, Sony was terrible, but you had one adversary that was with one victim. And if we could drive the average number of victims per incident down to a 1-to-1 ratio, closer to a 1-to-1 ratio, instead of 1 to thousands, something like getting our heads around that, we are way better off. Because then we have individual sad stories rather than a systemic critical infrastructure crisis.
Yeah, I have bad news for you because I don't think that number is going down at all. I think that number is going to trend up for a while because of the interdependentness of supply chain and third party. And so we'll be catching a lot of strays like the sales loft drift stuff now, right? And you can draw everything out to one fundamental weakness there. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. That would be an indication that things are getting better. I don't think I wouldn't hold my breath for that one getting better just now, if you know what I mean.
And Alex, when we were doing our report from that came out in the law fair called "Are Cyber Defenders Winning?" or something like that, we were seeing a lot to like in threat and vulnerability. Things were going a lot better way, especially in vulnerability. The stuff from Veracode, we're not seeing in consequence. Yeah, in the consequence side, it's still pretty bad.
Yeah, so we could probably keep talking about this for a very long time, and I'll stay interested, but unfortunately have to bring it to a close. So I'm going to wrap it up with a question of, so where do we go from here? And what should we do next? What should we focus on as kind of next steps to move from kind of, considering a whole bunch of different metrics to actually selecting some metrics at the national level, maybe working with the NCD to pick some to start working with. How do we actually do that? What are some of the next steps we could do? And Alex, maybe I'll start with you on that.
Well, I think the biggest thing for me is there's a lot of exploration is still needed, right? And again, I think Jason, both the work that you and Jason have been doing has been very, fundamental on the foundational level to kind of bring this discussion to open. I think the secret right now is, we need more ecosystem level data to explore. And so like share early, share often, right? Figure out what you can share about your information. And I'm not necessarily saying to share it with me. Join your local ISAC, your industry ISAC, figure out a way that you can be helpful, right? Maybe the information that you have can strengthen the security of a whole industry, right? Talk to law enforcement, right? Anything that we do, any piece of information that we share can potentially, again, make it easier for that the next person don't fall into it, right? And as we get the better understanding, even on the industry level by the ISACs, it gives us the opportunity to find and explore better metrics for us to be able to do a more comprehensive work, I think.
Great. Thanks, Alex. Wade?
I'd like to see a more scientific approach over it all. I think you may have mentioned this. Wow, that sounds an awful lot like a hypothesis and testing procedure. And as basic as that sounds, it is shockingly rare, I think, in the things that we're talking about. So, I'd like to see a proposal of what are the most important things to measure at national, if that's where we're talking, level. What would we expect, or how would we want these things to go? If we do these things, how would we expect those things to change? And then follow up over time. Is that happening? If not, why not? Is something broken? Are we measuring the wrong thing? Are we interpreting it incorrectly, et cetera? And you keep revising, but that sustained process of doing it, and that's the problem, is these things happen over time at a macro scale, and it's very difficult to get consistency over the length of time to really answer, are things changing, and get a sense of what is causing those changes. But I think we need to start.
Yep. I agree. It's a good argument for a Bureau of National Cyber Statistics, or a National
Let me know
Cyber
when it gets
Statistics
formed.
Bureau. Yep. Chris?
Yeah, I think well, one thing I just heard was, Mandiant and Verizon both sharing, mean time to detect data, and hopefully they're doing it in similar ways. We need more organizations sharing the same data. One of the criticisms when Jay and I presented the Veracode data at RSA was, oh, but that's just Veracode customers. And I'm like, yes, it's better. It is, but it's better than nothing, right? It's like 5% of the doctors in New England are reporting their communicable diseases. It's still better than nothing, right? And it shows some trend, but we really need more organizations to do this. More organizations that have this data, and more have it today, because like we've moved to a SaaS world, right, where we have all this data in one place, and there's so many different cybersecurity companies that are SaaS now. So I think we do have the opportunity to access a lot of data, but people are sharing it differently. There's other reports that are kind of similar to the Veracode report. So we just have to sort of standardize and incent the people who have the data to share it. And, I don't see any of that happening right now.
Yep. Thank you, Chris. And that's a good argument for CISA actually getting the CERCIA rule out the door, so that at least our critical infrastructure companies are required to start reporting something into the government, so we start to develop some of these statistics. All right, Jay, I'll give you the almost last word here before I close this out.
Okay, coolest for last. I appreciate that. I just really want to reinforce what Chris had just said, right? This information is pooling already in some locations. And so it'd be really great if we get more of these reports that are reporting in a time series. And in the article we put in Lawfare, our cyber defense, we've got a potential framework of saying, all right, if you're talking about mean time to detect, for us, that was threat actor operations, right? It's talking about the actual behavior of the threat actors. We've got other categories, in vulnerability and consequence that can be looking across. And so I think that's a huge step if we can get folks that say, wait a minute, this is a defensibility relevant metric, or this is a metric that ties to something in the national cybersecurity strategy or other national equivalent. Let me call that out on a separate page. Let me do a text box. Let me say this applies, because that's going to make it a lot easier for us. Two is for ONCD and the other policymakers, right? Have a strategy that is measurable, like talk to the communities like us beforehand, propose the kinds of ways that might be measured, even if those measurements don't really exist. Propose the hypothesis, right? If we do X, Y, and Z, then we should see this kind of activity go down. Because now it's the kind of thing we can get our teeth in. And last, we're hoping that at Columbia University, we're going to restart our New York Cyber Task Force, which started some of this work to say, how do we have a more defensible cyberspace and the rest? And so we're hoping to be doing some additional work on that, as well as Spin Digital and a lot of other folks that are doing awesome work in this space. So like more energy to those, and if governments or others can kind of help those things along. Great, thanks, thank you, Mike.
Yeah, well, thank you, gentlemen, for joining me today in this really interesting discussion. I would say keep an eye out for future RSA presentations. Keep an eye out for some articles on, that I might have a hand in proposing some actually concrete metrics. And if you don't like my metrics, that's great. Let's have a discussion about them and talk about which ones might be better. Because this is all about the scientific process of, making the process better. So I think there's a lot of actual reason for optimism in this area for us to actually start having real measurement that can inform policy decisions, both at an organizational level, at a regional level, and at a national level, and even at an ecosystem-wide level. So I think there's a lot of interesting work to be done here. So thank you very much for joining me today, and I really enjoyed the discussion.